It was a typical morning in the courtroom, the type of day where nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The kind of day where the hum of hushed whispers, the shuffle of papers, and the occasional gavel strike blended together in a rhythm so familiar it almost seemed like a second heartbeat for those who spent their lives inside these walls. Judge Charles Graves was accustomed to this. After all, he had been sitting on the bench for over 2 decades. But for all his years of service, for all his carefully cultivated experience, that morning would mark the start of a series of events that would shatter the illusions he had long held about justice, authority, and power. Judge Graves was a man who had come to rely on the patterns of life. He had seen it all. He thought the criminals, the lawyers, the witnesses. And in many ways, the courtroom had become a stage for him to play the part of the ultimate arbiter of truth. To him, the roles were clear. The defendants were the ones who needed his guidance. The lawyers were the ones who would challenge his authority, and he was the one who would uphold the law with calm authority. He was the center of this world, and he had always felt that his judgment was both just and unquestionable. On this particular morning, however, things would not unfold according to his usual script. The first case of the day was typical in its appearance, a minor legal dispute between 2 individuals over a traffic violation. The defendant, a woman who had entered the courtroom with a quiet, almost imperceptible air of unease, was there to face the charges against her. Graves had seen thousands of similar cases routine, forgettable, and it was clear to him that she would be just another face in the crowd, another name on his list of cases. She was a woman of average height, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, dressed in a modest suit that did nothing to suggest she was anything other than a typical defendant. Her eyes, however, seemed to carry something beneath their surface, an intelligence, a sharpness that Graves, in his routine, had overlooked. She spoke with a calm demeanor, offering no excuses but also no apologies. She simply presented her case, requesting that the court consider the circumstances that had led to her driving violation. It was at this moment that Judge Graves, in his habitual way, did what he had done countless times before. He assumed that she was just like all the others. He didn't look beyond her appearance or question her background. She was another case to be processed, another face to judge, another person whose life was about to be dictated by the court's decision. Guilty, he pronounced after a brief pause, his voice carrying the finality of a decision made. A fine of $500. It was a standard ruling, and yet something about the way he handed it down seemed to linger in the air. The woman's face remained stoic, her expression unreadable, but Graves, in his arrogance, thought little of it. She nodded politely, accepting the verdict with no argument, no challenge. She was, after all, just a defendant, and he, the judge. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known in that moment, was that the woman standing before him was not just another defendant. She was not just someone to be processed through the system, someone whose life could be swept aside with a simple stroke of the gavel. She was someone far more important, far more powerful than he had ever imagined. Serena Blake, as it turned out, was not just another name on a docket. She wasn't just some random woman caught in the web of bureaucracy. Serena Blake was, in fact, a federal prosecutor, a woman with the authority to command the attention of the highest offices in the country, a woman with a reputation built on decades of legal expertise, a woman whose intellect had seen her rise to the ranks of the most influential legal minds in the United Kingdom. But Judge Graves had not seen any of that. He had seen only what was in front of him. He had seen a woman, perhaps a little too quiet, a little too unassuming for his liking, and he had made a judgment based on his own assumptions. He had dismissed her without so much as a thought. It was until later, after the court session had ended, that the full weight of his mistake began to settle in. As Graves sat in his chambers, reviewing the day's cases, he was approached by one of the court clerks. "Judge," the clerk said, "there's something I think you should see." The clerk handed him a file, one that had not come from the day's proceedings, but from a much more recent development. The file contained information about Serena Blake, information that made Graves' heart sink. It detailed her work as a prosecutor, her numerous high-profile cases, and her role in some of the most challenging legal battles of the past decade. It was clear that Serena Blake was not just any woman. She was someone who had dedicated her life to upholding justice, and now, it seemed, justice had been called into question by none other than Judge Graves himself. The shock was overwhelming. He had been so certain of his own infallibility, so sure that his decisions were always right, that he had never thought to question the assumptions he made about the people who appeared before him. But in that moment, he realized the full extent of his error. He had failed to see the woman in front of him for who she truly was, and in doing so, he had made a mistake that could cost him dearly. As he sat back in his chair, his mind raced. What had driven him to make such a quick and careless judgment? Had it been his years of experience? Had it been his own unconscious biases, the stereotypes he had carried with him throughout his career? Or had it simply been his need to maintain control, to uphold an image of authority that didn't allow for mistakes, for humanity? Graves didn't have the answers. All he knew was that the woman he had dismissed so easily was not just another defendant. She was someone who had the power to challenge everything he thought he knew about the law, about the world, and now she had every reason to make him pay for his ignorance. The next few days would be filled with tension as the news about Judge Graves' ruling spread. The legal community was buzzing with whispers, with stories of the woman who was wrongly fined. But it wasn't until Serena Blake's name was mentioned in connection with the case that the truth began to dawn on everyone. It was no longer just about the fine. It was about the consequences of judging someone without knowing who they truly are. And as the ripples of this story spread, as the story of the judge who had made such a grave mistake began to circulate, Serena Blake remained silent. She did not rush to publicize her credentials, to seek revenge for the judge's actions. Instead, she waited, watching from the sidelines, knowing that the system would reveal itself in time, just as she had known it would. The story of that courtroom encounter would unfold in ways Judge Graves could never have predicted. The lessons he would learn, the consequences he would face, would be as profound as they were humbling. And it would all begin with a single moment, a single assumption, and a woman whose quiet dignity would leave an indelible mark on his life. The courtroom was quieter than usual as Judge Charles Graves reviewed the papers in front of him. The morning session had concluded, and he was preparing for the next round of cases. His mind, sharp from years of experience, was already moving to the next verdict, the next decision. It was in these small moments of transition that he could often relax, even if just for a moment, and enjoy the rhythm of his authority. But as the clerk entered his chambers with a file in hand, Judge Graves couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. He had just dismissed his first case for the day, the minor traffic violation, the woman in the quiet suit, Serena Blake. He hadn't given her much thought after issuing the fine. It wasn't the kind of case that demanded attention. She'd been polite, unemotional, and most importantly, there had been no need for further deliberation. She was, as he saw it, just another minor defendant, her case one of many that came and went without incident. The clerk, a young woman named Emily, placed the file gently on the judge's desk. "Judge Graves," she said, her voice tinged with a sense of uncertainty. "I think you might want to take a look at this." Graves, already focused on the stack of documents before him, waved her off dismissively. "I'm sure it can wait," he said, barely looking up. But Emily didn't leave. She stood there, waiting, with a quiet resolve. Something in her posture caught the judge's attention, a shift in her demeanor that made him glance up. Emily's usual calm expression was replaced with something that suggested urgency, even concern. Graves sighed, adjusting his glasses, and finally opened the file. It looked like a routine update, a simple report about the defendant from the morning session. But as he began to read, his brow furrowed. The first page detailed Serena Blake's personal information, her name, her address, and her play. Sea of employment. So far, so ordinary. But then, as Graves flipped through the following pages, something caught his eye. It was a section dedicated to her professional background, a detailed list of her accomplishments. And that's when the realization hit him. Serena Blake was not just another defendant. She wasn't just some minor participant in the system. The file outlined her long career as a federal prosecutor, one of the most respected legal minds in the country. She had worked on countless high-profile cases, securing convictions against some of the most notorious criminals in the United Kingdom. But it wasn't just her resume that stunned Graves. It was the sheer weight of her career, the people she had worked alongside, the cases she had handled. Serena Blake had been involved in some of the most complex and difficult legal battles in the nation. Judge Graves could feel his pulse quicken as he continued to read. How had he missed this? How had he, a man so proud of his understanding of the law, made such a monumental mistake? He reread her name, his mind racing. The reality of what had happened was only now beginning to set in. He had fined Serena Blake a federal prosecutor, a woman whose career was built on upholding the very laws he had sworn to protect. And he had done it without a second thought, without even bothering to check her credentials, without considering who she was. Graves slammed the file shut, his hands trembling. The guilt and shock hit him like a wave. How could he have been so careless, so dismissive? He had handed down a fine with such ease, assuming that she was just another woman caught up in the system. He hadn't thought to question her, to look past her unassuming demeanor and ask the questions that might have revealed her true identity. But now it was too late. The damage was done. Emily, noticing the judge's growing distress, hesitated before speaking. "Judge, there's more," she said quietly. "I thought you might want to know. It looks like this case is going to make the rounds." The moment her name hit the system, some of the higher-ups got wind of it. Words spreading quickly. This isn't just going to be some small matter. Graves felt his stomach drop. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that he could simply move on, bury the mistake and forget about it. But now it seemed that the situation was spiraling beyond his control. The legal community would soon know. The press would get wind of it, and Serena Blake would not let him off lightly. His mind raced. What were the consequences of his actions? What would happen now? He had handed down a fine, a judgment, to someone who had the power to destroy him with a single word. Serena Blake was not just any lawyer. She was a figure of authority, a woman who could move mountains in the legal world with her connections and her expertise. And now, he had inadvertently made an enemy of her, a person whose influence could, and likely would, come crashing down on him. Judge Graves leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his greying hair. He had been a judge for 22 years, and in all that time he had prided himself on his ability to make fair, reasoned decisions. He had never once considered the idea that he might make a mistake of this magnitude, and certainly not one that could come back to haunt him in such a dramatic way. Emily stood awkwardly at the door, her eyes not meeting his, as if unsure whether she should say more. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the room. Graves, for the first time in years, felt vulnerable, exposed. "Is there anything else?" he asked, his voice low, as if he were trying to keep the panic from seeping through. Emily hesitated before nodding. "Well, there's one other thing. It seems like Ms. Blake wasn't just in for a traffic violation. There's talk that she was conducting an undercover operation, gathering information on a case, and that this case might have ties to some very influential figures. I'm not sure if that's true, but I thought you'd want to know." The room seemed to close in around him. Serena Blake was not just a prosecutor. She was a player in a much larger game, one that had consequences far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Graves had unknowingly crossed paths with someone whose reach extended far beyond the law, someone whose connections could change everything. His thoughts turned to the implications of his actions. He had made a judgment without thinking, without doing the due diligence that any good judge should have done. He had failed to see beyond the surface, and now he was facing the consequences. But there was more at stake than just his career. Serena Blake had been wronged, and in a way that no one could have predicted. The fine he had imposed wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a symbol of his failure to recognize the nuances of the case, the importance of the person standing before him. And in the legal world, that kind of misstep was unforgivable. Graves felt the weight of the decision crushing him. His authority, once unshakable, had been called into question, and it would be impossible to ignore the repercussions. He knew that what had started as a simple court case would now spiral into something much larger, something that would demand answers, accountability, and perhaps his resignation. The weeks following Judge Graves's realization were a blur of mounting tension and relentless pressure. What had begun as a simple case, one that the judge had assumed would quickly fade into the annals of his routine, had escalated into a nightmare that threatened not only his career but his very place within the legal system. The news spread faster than Graves could have ever anticipated. The story of the fine imposed on Serena Blake, a respected federal prosecutor, soon became a subject of widespread discussion. Legal circles buzzed with speculation. Some questioned how a seasoned judge like Graves could have missed the gravity of his decision, while others wondered why Blake, a figure of such prominence, would have even been in his court in the first place. The whispers started in the corridors of power, and before long, they were spilling into the press. Headlines screamed about the judge's mistake, and a federal prosecutor humiliated by the court. The media, ever hungry for scandal, latched onto the story, portraying Graves as a fool who had failed to recognize the weight of his own judgment. But it wasn't just the press that concerned Graves. It was the whispers coming from within the judicial system itself. As soon as Serena Blake's name began circulating, the once steadfast respect that Graves had enjoyed from his peers began to erode. Invitations to private meetings were rescinded. The phone calls he used to receive calls from colleagues seeking advice or discussing important cases had stopped altogether. It seemed that the walls were closing in around him, and the network of relationships he had built over decades of legal practice was now crumbling. Graves found himself isolated. Even the simplest interactions with his staff had become fraught with tension. Emily, the clerk who had delivered the news to him initially, seemed increasingly nervous around him. Her polite but guarded demeanor was a stark contrast to the confident, approachable attitude she once had. Every time she handed him a document, her eyes seemed to linger with an unspoken question. Will this be the one that ends it all? And then there was the growing presence of Serena Blake herself. Serena had initially kept a low profile, no doubt considering her options and waiting for the right moment to strike. But as the media frenzy surrounding the case continued to grow, her public silence began to speak volumes. It wasn't until a few weeks later that the first communication from Blake's legal team arrived, a formal request for an emergency hearing, along with a letter of grievance detailing the judge's error and requesting a full review of the fine he had imposed. The tone of the letter was polite, but there was a distinct undercurrent of authority and disdain. The formalities of legal discourse were clear, but what stung more than anything was the implicit accusation. Serena Blake wasn't simply asking for an apology or a minor adjustment. She was calling into question his integrity as a judge, suggesting that his error was not just a mistake, it was indicative of a deeper failure in his judgment. The letter wasn't just a request for redress. It was a declaration of war. Graves, who had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm under pressure, now found himself in a constant state of unease. He had faced difficult cases before, but never one like this. Serena Blake was no ordinary prosecutor. She was an experienced and formidable adversary, a woman who had worked her way up the legal ranks with skill and precision. If anyone could take down a judge, it was her. For the first time in his career, Graves felt vulnerable. He had spent years building his reputation on his unwavering sense of justice and fairness. Yet, in the wake of his mistake, that very reputation had become his greatest liability. The public, the media, and the legal community had all turned against him. The fine was no longer the issue. The issue was the perception that Judge Graves was no longer the man to uphold the law. But Serena wasn't just a distant figure in this story, she was actively involved in the unfolding drama. The very fact that she was a federal prosecutor only added fuel to the fire. She was a professional with connections, and those connections stretched deep into the heart of the legal system. It wasn't long before Graves started receiving letters from colleagues, some of whom had worked alongside Serena in the past. They were carefully worded, but the message was clear: do not underestimate her. Serena Blake was not someone to be crossed. The pressure mounted as Graves was summoned to an informal meeting with the higher-ups in the judiciary. The tone was casual at first, but there was an unmistakable air of discomfort hanging over the proceedings. The senior judges who had called for the meeting were polite but distant, their eyes fixed on Graves as if they were waiting for him to offer an explanation. But there was no room for explanation. They had all seen the same headlines, heard the same rumors, and understood the same implications. One of the senior judges, a stern woman named Judge Evelyn Harrow, spoke first. "Judge Graves, we've been following the developments in your case with some concern. You know how delicate matters like these can be. A federal prosecutor is not someone to be taken lightly." Her voice, calm and measured, did nothing to hide the underlying judgment. "We need to discuss the course of action moving forward." Graves felt a lump form in his throat. He had known this meeting was coming, but the reality of it hit him hard. These were the people he had respected for years, people he had relied on for guidance and support. And now, it seemed, they were ready to distance themselves from him. It was a cold reminder that in the world of law, there was little room for error. One mistake, one slip-up, and you could find yourself alone, with nothing but your regret for company. Judge Harrow continued, "We understand that the fine was issued in good faith, but given the circumstances, it might be prudent to consider a review of your decision. Perhaps it's best to allow the matter to be handled by another judge." Her eyes locked onto Graves. "We want to avoid any perception of bias, and it might be wise to step aside from this case." It was a direct hit to his pride. Stepping aside was tantamount to admitting failure, a failure that had now been made public, one that could not be undone. Graves' mind raced. He wanted to argue, to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Every part of him wanted to stand firm, to defend his decision, but he knew deep down that the matter had already spiraled too far. Serena Blake had made sure of that. She had turned what should have been a minor infraction into a symbol of something far greater, the vulnerability of a judge who had allowed his authority to be undermined. She had become his adversary, and she was playing the game to win. The room grew silent, the air thick with expectation. Graves felt the weight of his options pressing down on him. He could either accept the review, admit that his judgment had been flawed, and risk further humiliation, or he could fight, drawing out a battle that would only escalate the conflict, pushing the legal system to its limits. Neither option was appealing, but what haunted him most was the knowledge that this was no longer just about a fine. It was about power. The battle between Serena Blake and Judge Graves wasn't just a personal dispute. It was a collision of authority, and in this case, the consequences of losing were far greater than anything Graves could have imagined. Weeks of mounting pressure had taken their toll on Judge Graves. His professional life, once a testament to his unwavering commitment to the law, was now in chaos. The case that had initially seemed like a simple clerical mistake was now threatening to unravel everything he had worked for. The media buzzed, legal circles whispered, and the respect he had earned over decades was slipping through his fingers. But amidst the turmoil, one thing remained. Graves still had a sense of pride, an undying belief in his own righteousness, and the faint hope that this nightmare could be put to rest. What he didn't know, however, was that the key to his salvation or damnation would soon come from the unlikeliest of sources. It wasn't going to come from his peers or the judicial system, which had distanced itself from him. Nor would it come from his defense, for it seemed that no one was willing to stand by him in this moment of crisis. Instead, it would come from an unexpected revelation, one that would change the course of the battle between him and Serena Blake. One rainy afternoon, a letter arrived at Graves's chambers. It wasn't an official document, nor was it from the usual stack of case files that appeared on his desk. This letter was different, handwritten, with no return address. The paper was thick, and the handwriting, though elegant, carried an air of urgency. As Graves opened the envelope, the scent of ink and aged paper wafted up, and he felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. The letter, composed in precise, deliberate strokes, read, "Judge Graves, there is more to this case than meets the eye. Serena Blake, the prosecutor whose case has shaken you to your core, has a history that goes far beyond her title. If you wish to clear your name, you must follow the trail. It is a trail that will lead you to the truth, but it will also lead you to the most dangerous secrets of the judicial system itself. An old friend." Graves stared at the letter for what felt like hours. His heart raced, his thoughts jumbled. The mention of an old friend felt cryptic, yet familiar, as though the person who had written this knew him intimately. Who could it be? Who had sent this to him? And most importantly, what was the truth this letter was alluding to? For the first time in weeks, a sense of clarity washed over him. It was as if the chaos surrounding him momentarily paused and the haze lifted. There was something more to this case, something hidden beneath the essay. Face. Serena Blake, a woman whose name had become synonymous with his downfall, was not the innocent victim she appeared to be. The letter spoke of a trail that Graves now felt compelled to follow. Graves immediately began his investigation, combing through old case files, correspondence, and personal notes. His every move felt charged with the weight of the mystery. As he delved deeper, he unearthed small, seemingly insignificant details that had long been buried. It began with her history, Serena Blake's ascent through the legal ranks, which, on the surface, had always appeared flawless. Her reputation as a fierce federal prosecutor had been carefully curated, a masterpiece of professional accomplishments that made her untouchable. But now, with the revelation in his hands, Graves saw the cracks. Blake had been involved in several high-profile cases where things hadn't gone according to plan. Cases that had been dismissed with little explanation. Cases where key evidence had mysteriously vanished or witnesses had failed to appear. Graves's mind spun with the possibilities. Had Serena Blake been pulling strings behind the scenes, manipulating cases to her advantage? And more importantly, was this case the fine he had imposed merely a distraction, a carefully orchestrated play to silence him? The deeper Graves dug, the more questions arose. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. Serena Blake had become a symbol of something far more sinister. A prosecutor whose rise to power had been aided by questionable tactics, one who had built her reputation on a foundation that was anything but solid. Then, the breakthrough came. Graves was poring over old legal documents when he stumbled upon an article that had been published years earlier, buried deep within the archives of a small, regional paper. It was an obscure piece, barely more than a blip in the public eye to the time. But to Graves, it was the key, a clue that no one had connected. The article reported the sudden, unexplained resignation of a former colleague of Serena Blake's, a judge who had served in a district not far from the one Graves currently oversaw. The judge's departure had been shrouded in mystery, with little information given to the public. But this article, written in a time before Serena Blake had gained her federal appointment, offered a chilling insight. It turned out that the judge had been investigating Serena Blake for what the article referred to as suspicious activities involving her handling of certain cases. Graves was stunned. Had Serena Blake been involved in something far worse than he had imagined? Had her climb to power been built on more than just legal acumen? Had she been manipulating the system to further her own agenda? Graves couldn't believe what he was reading. The judge's resignation had been framed as a personal issue, an unexpected decision. But the more he read, the more he understood that this had been a deliberate exit. This was no mere coincidence. The judge had likely been forced out of the system to cover up Blake's manipulation, and the fact that he had been investigating her made it clear that the lengths to which Blake was willing to go were far more insidious than Graves had ever imagined. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Graves discovered a sealed case file, one that had never been made public, but was now part of his personal collection as a judge. The case was a complex one, involving several high-profile figures from both the legal and political worlds. At first, it seemed irrelevant, another closed case, but upon further inspection, it became clear that Serena Blake's name had been linked to it in ways that had never been disclosed to the public. She had been involved, not as a prosecutor, but as a shadowy fig. You're working behind the scenes to influence the outcome of the case. Her role had been kept hidden, perhaps to protect her career, or perhaps because someone with power had been pulling strings to ensure her silence. Graves felt a surge of revelation and fear. He had unwittingly become entangled in a web that went far beyond a simple courtroom error. Serena Blake wasn't just a prosecutor who had been offended by his judgment. She was a mastermind with far-reaching influence, someone who had carefully manipulated the system to avoid scrutiny. And now, she had targeted him. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about power, and Serena Blake had the power to destroy him. As the weight of this knowledge settled over Graves, he realized that he had reached a point of no return. The truth was now in his hands, and it was more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The question was no longer whether he could clear his name, but whether he had the courage to expose the depths of Serena Blake's corruption, and whether he was willing to risk everything, including his career, to do so. The revelation had come too late for him to simply walk away. The battle was no longer about who was right or wrong, it was about survival. And in this high-stakes game, the rules were changing and there was no turning back. Judge Samuel Graves sat in his dimly lit office, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on him. His fingers absent-mindedly tapped against the wooden desk, the rhythmic sound barely cutting through the thick silence. The revelation that had come to him so suddenly seemed to echo in his mind, reverberating with the implications of what it meant for both his career and his life. In all his years on the bench, Graves had prided himself on his impartiality, his ability to dispense justice without bias or fear. He had always believed in the sanctity of the legal system, in its potential to right wrongs and uphold the principles of fairness. But now, as he sat in the solitude of his chambers, he could no longer ignore the nagging feeling that everything he had worked for had been a lie, or, at the very least, a carefully constructed facade. He had been played. And not just by Serena Blake, but by a system that had been corrupted from within. The discovery of the sealed case file had shattered the illusion of order he had clung to for so long. Graves had always believed that the judicial system was above reproach, that the scales of justice were weighted fairly. But the documents he had uncovered, the secrets hidden in plain sight, the compromises made behind closed doors, painted a far more sinister picture. Serena Blake, the federal prosecutor who had seemingly come out of nowhere to challenge him, was not merely a lawyer seeking justice. She was a part of a much larger machine, one that operated on manipulation and subterfuge, a machine designed to maintain a delicate balance of power and control. Graves leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as the realization slowly settled into him. It wasn't just that Serena Blake had used him as a pawn in her game of legal chess. It wasn't even that she had systematically dismantled his career in a bid to cover her own tracks. What gnawed at him now was the understanding that he had been part of the system all along, a system that was as corrupt as the very forces he had once sworn to protect the public from. His mind wandered back to the cases he had presided over in the years leading up to this one. The faces of the defendants, the victims, the lawyers, all seemed to blur together in his memory. He had been so sure, so convinced that his decisions had been righteous, that they had been based on the law and nothing else. But now, he wondered how many of those decisions had been influenced, how many had been nudged along by unseen hands, ensuring that the right outcome was reached for the right people. Had he been so blinded by his own sense of justice that he had failed to see the dark undercurrents swirling beneath the surface? A part of him wanted to dismiss these thoughts. He was a judge, after all. His duty was to uphold the law, not to question its integrity. He had always believed that as long as he acted in accordance with the law, he had nothing to fear. But now he knew the truth. The law wasn't a singular force, a bastion of fairness. It was a system, one that could be bent, broken, and manipulated by those who held power. And Serena Blake, with her calculated rise to prominence, had mastered the art of bending that system to her will. As Graves sat in his office, a bitter realization began to settle in. This wasn't just a personal battle anymore. It was a fight for the very soul of the judicial system, a battle that had been brewing for years and had now come to a head. Serena Blake wasn't just a prosecutor looking for revenge. She was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system, and she had used him as a means to further her own agenda. Graves rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the situation crash down on him. He had been so focused on his own reputation, so obsessed with maintaining his position on the bench, that he had failed to see the bigger picture. He had underestimated Serena Blake, thought her to be just another ambitious lawyer with an axe to grind. But she was far more than that. She was a force, a puppet master pulling the strings behind the scenes, orchestrating a series of events that had slowly but surely led him down the path to ruin. The letter had been his first clue. The cryptic message, the reference to an old friend. It had all seemed so vague, so far removed from the concrete reality of the case he was dealing with. But as he pieced together the fragments of information, and as he dug deeper into Blake's past and her involvement in various cases, the truth became undeniable. Blake had manipulated him, yes. but she had also manipulated the entire system. And now she was in control of the narrative, painting herself as the victim in a drama she had scripted from the very beginning. Graves felt a cold rush of dread sweep over him as he thought about the power Blake had wielded. She was not some lone prosecutor looking for retribution. She was part of a network, a web of influence that spanned the highest echelons of power in the legal world, and he had been caught in it, helpless and unaware. The sheer scale of her machinations made his stomach churn. He was just one piece in a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that was still being assembled, with every new piece bringing him closer to a truth that could destroy him. As the realization settled deeper into his bones, Graves knew that he had no choice but to act. He could no longer afford to be passive, to let events unfold without his involvement. He had to take control of the situation not just to clear his name, but to expose the system that had allowed people like Serena Blake to thrive. He had to reveal the truth, no matter the cost. But how? He was a judge, bound by the very system that had betrayed him. He couldn't just walk into a courtroom and accuse Serena Blake of corruption without solid evidence. And even if he did have evidence, would anyone believe him? Would anyone care? The thought of facing the same colleagues and superiors who had distanced themselves from him, who had silently stood by as he was vilified, filled him with dread. Graves closed his eyes and took a deep breath. This was no longer just about his career. It was about justice, real justice. The kind of justice he had once believed in, the kind that didn't bend to the whims of the powerful. And in order to restore that justice, he would have to sacrifice everything. The choice was clear. He would expose Serena Blake. He would uncover the truth about her rise to power, her manipulation of the system, and the way she had used the law as a weapon to further her own interests. It would not be easy. It would not be without risk. But it was the only way to ensure that the system could be saved and that his own legacy would not be defined by a moment of weakness. Graves sat back in his chair, the weight of the realization now settled into his chest. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. The game was changing. And it was time for him to make his move. The days that followed Judge Samuel Graves' realization were a blur. Once a man of composure and certainty, he now found himself a prisoner of his own choices, grappling with the weight of his decision to expose Serena Blake and the system she had manipulated. The world he had known, the world of law and order, was now a landscape of treachery and uncertainty. Every step he took seemed to lead him further into a labyrinth with no clear escape. Graves had never thought he would find himself in such a precarious position. He had spent decades as a judge, upholding the law, earning the respect of his peers, and building a reputation for fairness. His decisions had been final, unwavering. But now, his very foundation had been shaken, leaving him questioning everything he had once believed to be true. Serena Blake's machinations had unearthed a web of corruption so vast that even the most well-established figures in the system seemed to be tainted. In the days that followed his realization, he had tried to be cautious. He had sought counsel from colleagues, hoping to find someone who might understand the severity of the situation, someone who might help him navigate this minefield. But instead of finding support, he had been met with silence, coldness, and an unsettling sense of isolation. It was as if the moment he began to question the integrity of the system, he had crossed an invisible line. His peers were now wary of him, unsure of where his loyalties lay, and uncertain whether he was a threat to the delicate balance of power they had worked so hard to maintain. The consequences of his actions were immediate and far-reaching. Within days, a smear campaign began. Anonymous sources began leaking stories to the press, casting Graves as a disgraced judge who had lost his ability to dispense justice. The media, ever hungry for scandal, seized upon the story with reckless abandon. Headlines screamed of his alleged incompetence, his supposed failure to uphold the law. The truth, once a clear and unshakable beacon, was now distorted into something dark and unrecognizable. Graves watched helplessly as his reputation unraveled before him. His colleagues, once his peers and allies, began distancing themselves. The judge who had once commanded the courtroom with authority was now a pariah. His every move was scrutinized, every decision questioned. His long-standing tenure on the bench, the career he had worked so hard to build, was now at risk of being destroyed in a matter of days. But the worst consequence, the one that cut deepest, was the disillusionment that followed. Graves had spent so much of his life believing in the ideals of the law. He had held fast to the notion that the judiciary was a noble institution, one that was above reproach. Now, as he faced the consequences of his decisions, he was forced to confront the stark reality. The law was not the pure institution he had once thought it to be. It was a system, a deeply flawed system, that could be bent and manipulated by those with enough power and influence. And as he grappled with this truth, Graves was left to wonder, had his entire life's work been a lie? The public backlash was only the beginning. The internal pressures at the courthouse were far more crushing. Graves' once promising career was now hanging by a thread. The disciplinary committee that oversaw judicial conduct was called to review his case. They were thorough, methodical, and unyielding in their examination. At every turn, it seemed that new allegations arose, each one more damning than the last. Was he complicit in the corruption that Serena Blake had exposed? Had he knowingly allowed injustice to prevail in his courtroom? Graves had no choice but to defend himself, to push back against the mounting tide of accusations. But no matter how much he tried to explain himself, the more the legal world turned its back on him. His allies, those few who had once supported him, now stood silent, unwilling to risk their own positions by associating with a judge who was now viewed as a liability. The courtroom, once his domain, had become a hostile environment, where even his most basic decisions were scrutinized and questioned. In private, the toll on Graves was just as severe. The sleepless nights became a constant companion, and his once great sense of purpose was replaced with a gnawing sense of doubt and regret. He had been so focused on exposing the corruption within the system, so consumed by the need for justice, that he had failed to see the personal cost. Every interaction with his family, his friends, his colleagues, had become tainted by the cloud of scandal that hung over him. His reputation had been shattered, and in its place was a man stripped of his dignity and his confidence. The financial consequences were just as harsh. The legal fees, the cost of defending himself against the relentless barrage of allegations, drained his savings. What had once been a comfortable life, one marked by the respect of his peers and the admiration of his community, was now teetering on the brink of collapse. The future that had once seemed so certain was now clouded by uncertainty and fear. And then, of course, there were the professional consequences. The judiciary, a body that once held him in high regard, now saw him as a liability. His career on the bench was all but over. No one would look at him in the same way again. Even if he managed to avoid formal disbarment or suspension, the damage to his professional life had been done. His future prospects in the legal field had been irreparably damaged. The public, his peers, and even his family saw him as a man who had fallen from grace, a man who could never again return to the life he once knew. The final consequence, perhaps the most bitter of all, was the loss of his sense of self. Graves had built his entire identity around his career as a judge, around the belief that he was a protector of the law, a pillar of justice. But now, that identity had been shattered. He was no longer the man he had once been. He had failed not just his career, but the very system he had sworn to uphold. The personal shame he felt was suffocating. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw a man who had lost his way, a man who had traded his honor for a fleeting glimpse of truth. As the days turned into weeks, Graves began to realize that the consequences of his actions were far more than just professional or financial. They were personal, deep within the core of his being. The life he had built, the legacy he had once dreamed of leaving behind, was now in ruins. All for what? For the pursuit of justice? Or was it the pursuit of something more selfish, more driven by the desire to prove a point? The question lingered, unanswered, as Judge Samuel Graves sat in the quiet of his chambers, the weight of his choices pressing down on him with every passing moment. The consequences of his actions had been swift and unforgiving, but the cost was far greater than he had ever imagined. And now, there was no turning back. Judge Samuel Graves sat alone in his office late one evening, the weight of the world pressing down on him with an intensity he could no longer ignore. The office was eerily quiet, the usual hum of AOA, eagle proceedings and chatter now replaced with an oppressive silence that seemed to seep into his bones. His once pristine desk was now cluttered with piles of paperwork, case files, and a growing stack of messages from concerned colleagues, each one filled with uncertainty, doubt, or worse warning of further consequences if he did not tread carefully. But none of it mattered anymore. The world he had built was crumbling, piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The finality of it all had sunk in long ago, yet each day felt like another nail in his coffin. He had tried, with every fibre of his being, to maintain some semblance of control. He had fought for his career, for his reputation, and for the justice he had once believed in so deeply. But the more he fought, the more he realized the battle had already been lost. The consequences of his decisions, once distant and abstract, had now become his reality. The lies, the betrayals, the corruption, they had all taken their toll, not just on his career but on his very sense of self. For years, Judge Graves had lived by a strict code, a belief that the law was a bastion of truth, that justice could always prevail, if one had the courage to pursue it. But now, as he sat in his office, surrounded by the wreckage of his life, he could no longer reconcile the man he had been with the man he had become. He had been a part of a system that was broken, a system that, despite all his efforts, had failed the very people it was meant to protect. The case with Serena Blake had been the catalyst, the moment when everything changed. He had thought, at the time, that he was doing the right thing, exposing the corruption that had been festering in the shadows of the legal system. But in the process, he had unknowingly triggered a chain of events that had led to his own destruction. It had started with a simple sigh in a decision to question the system. But that decision had spiraled into something far bigger than he could have ever anticipated. The revelation of Blake's true identity, the discovery of the web of deceit she had woven, had unleashed a storm of consequences that Graves had never been prepared for. As the truth had unfolded, he had tried to hold on to his dignity, to maintain his composure. But with each passing day, it became clearer that the system he had trusted, the very foundation of his career, was flawed beyond repair. His colleagues had turned their backs on him, his peers had abandoned him, and the public, once eager to celebrate him as a defender of justice, now saw him as a failure. The law, once a guiding light, had become a murky and unpredictable force that seemed to bend to the will of those with power. Graves had hoped deep down that time would heal the wounds, that the storm would eventually pass. But with each new accusation, each new story that was leaked to the media, it became evident that the world he had once known was lost forever. The consequences were not just professional, they were personal. He had been betrayed by the very institution he had spent his life serving, and in doing so, he had lost everything. His career, his reputation, and his self-respect were gone. The man who had once been revered as a pillar of justice was now a pariah. And yet, despite the crushing weight of his downfall, there was a part of him that could not let go of the belief that he had done the right thing. The truth he had uncovered, the justice he had sought, it all still mattered, even if it had cost him everything. He had tried to bring light to the darkness within the system, and in doing so, he had exposed a truth that no one was willing to face. The corruption, the lies, the manipulation, they were all real, and they were all part of the world he had once sworn to protect. But now, as the pieces of his life fell apart, he wondered if it had all been worth it. The realization came slowly, over time, as the finality of his situation settled in. There was no going back. There would be no redemption. The system he had once believed in was beyond saving, and so too was he. His career was over, his reputation in tatters, and the life he had known was a distant memory. But there was something else, something deeper, something more painful than the loss of his career or his standing in society. It was the realization that the law, for all its flaws, was all he had ever known. It had been his compass, his guide through the complexities of life. But now, as he faced the consequences of his choices, that compass had shattered, leaving him adrift in a sea of uncertainty. Graves closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair as the weight of his thoughts consumed him. He had been a man of purpose, a man of principles. He had believed in the law, believed that it was a force for good. But now, as he looked back on the years of service, the countless cases he had presided over, He wondered if it had all been in vain. Had he made a difference? Or had he, like so many others, been complicit in the very system he had sworn to uphold? The final words he would speak as a judge were never written in a formal ruling or a legal brief. They were words he would never have expected to utter, words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As he looked out of his office window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, he understood the true cost of his actions. Justice was not just about the law, it was about the people, the lives that were affected by the decisions made in the courtroom. And in the end, the very thing he had sought to protect, the system he had trusted, had betrayed him. The law, it seemed, was as much a victim as he was.